real big into comic book media. And this past December, arguably, or at least for me, we had a movie release that was just so significantly important to me, and it was this movie, Spider-Man: No Way Home. Awesome. Is there? Right, awesome. Is there anyone who, show of hands, hasn't seen the movie? Okay, cool. And listen. I just want to take this moment in the service to commend you on your patience and ignorance. Your ability to stand tall against the pressure of this world. But anyways, so this movie came out. Super exciting, specifically because for those of you that watched it, if you remember like the whole marketing campaign, like all you really saw were villains from the old school Spider-Man movies. No one ever like confirmed that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were gonna show up in Tom Holland's world. So we were all like hoping for, expecting this to happen, but no one would confirm it. And sure enough, we all went to, well, except the like 30 of you, all went to our local movie theaters, and it was confirmed. Andrew Garfield busts into the movie shortly after, followed by Tobey Maguire, and it happens. All of our dreams come true, especially for me, having grown up seeing all these movies in high school, college, and even now, like I'm not gonna tell you how old I am, but as an adult man, seeing all these guys come together was such a dream come true. And if I have to be honest, one of my favorite scenes in this movie is when they're all at the top of Tom Holland's high school meeting for the first time. And if you remember this scene specifically, you remember that each one of these Spider-Men were like kind of taking turns, going around sharing about very special, very important people in their lives who motivate and inspire them in why they serve as Spider-Man. Right? Like they're all citing uncles and aunts, former girlfriends, and as they're going around taking turns talking about why they do what they do, they ultimately, like the classic mantra comes up, with great power comes awesome, right? And so they rally around this phrase. It ends up being this like really sweet, really precious, really beautiful moment where they all just kind of dwell in and recognize, man, this is why I do what I do. This is the motivation behind why I serve as Spider-Man, in my respective universe. And I tell you that story because tonight we're going to jump into a parable of Jesus where he's going to be trying to do something similar. This parable that Jesus is going to tell is going to serve as his. With great power comes great responsibility, because with this parable that we're going to look at tonight, Jesus is trying to explain to a listening audience the motivation behind why he does ministry the way that he does. And what's going to happen is, as we're diving into this parable, the motivation behind why Jesus does ministry that he does is ultimately the grace of God. The very generous grace of God is so inspiring and so motivating and so moving to Jesus that he's going to try and explain through this story that this is my motive, this is my inspiration. And my hope for us tonight, I think that if we can get to a spot where we could see not only the grace of God, but we could see it the way Jesus does, in all of its flavors and all of its textures and its deep richness and all of its generosity, I think it could do something crazy for us tonight. I think if we can recognize the grace of God the way Jesus sees it, something's going to be stirred in us. Something's going to be inspired in us. It's going to motivate us to take whatever our next step is in our respective faith journeys. And so one of the things I like to do, I always like to sum up our Bible study in one sentence, give you one simple phrase for you to hold on to as we progress throughout the rest of the evening. And so if I could sum up tonight in one simple sentence, in one phrase, it would be simply this, that with God's grace comes great generosity. I don't know why it says responsibility. With God's grace comes great generosity is the big idea, the simple phrase. With God's grace comes great generosity. And so here's the plan. Here's how we're going to go about this evening. We're going to look at this parable of Jesus, the parable of the lost son. And as we work through it, I'm going to stop in 4 different places. And each one of these 4 stops It's going to be us camping out a little bit just to understand a little bit more of the context and what's going on in that specific portion of the story, but also to unravel another texture, another flavor into the generous grace of God. And so I'm going to be starting in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. But before I do that, I want to set it up, right? Like Jesus didn't just start telling a story out of the blue. Something happened. And luckily for us, you've been spending some time in it all throughout the day with the parable of the lost coin and the lost sheep. But if you remember in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1, Jesus apparently has picked up a reputation of hanging out with what the Bible tells us is sinners and tax collectors. And long story short, these sinners and tax collectors that Jesus so willingly hangs out with and shares meals with, the religious leaders of the day are actually trying to keep their distance from this kind of people. They're trying to disassociate themselves from this kind of a people. And so when the religious leaders and the religious community would see Jesus so freely engaging with this kind of people, they started to question this, and they started to talk trash about Jesus behind his back, to the point that Jesus wanted to respond to this. And in his response to this questioning, to this doubting for why Jesus is doing ministry the way he's doing, Jesus goes and tells these three stories. And in these three stories, there's this common theme of God's grace. And Jesus is trying to highlight, man, if you only understood the grace of my heavenly Father, you would understand why it is that I'll engage with anyone and everyone that will have me. And so you've already looked at the first two stories. I want to jump into the third story that he tells as he's trying to explain, here's why I do ministry the way that I do. Here's why I'm so willing to engage with anyone and everyone that will have me. And so I'll start reading verse 11, Luke chapter 15. It says this: Jesus continued, there was a man who had two sons, and the younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. And so the father divided his property between them, the two sons. Now, right out of the gate, we get a first glimpse, like an initial flavor of the father's grace. But I've got to break this down a little bit, because what ends up happening here is we're introduced to the characters of the story, and then we're immediately confronted with a really foolish decision. And so these characters, you've got the father who's got two sons, one of which decides that it's a good idea to request of the father, hey, sell half of what you own and give it to me. Now, what you need to understand about that phrase, that question that he's asking, that request he's making to his dad, is there's a lot more underneath that's being communicated. There's a lot more that's happening underneath that's really just a foolish posture to begin with. It's a foolish proposition. And the reason I think it's so foolish is because in this question, this son is being both offensive and dumb. He's being really offensive to his father, and he's being dumb. And let me explain why. This transaction that he's requesting of the father selling half of what he owns so that the son can get it is an inheritance. And the transaction of an inheritance doesn't happen until somebody dies, specifically the father. And so literally in making this request, the son is looking at the father and saying, hey, Dad, my life would be better off if you were dead. I've reached the point where you breathing is no longer of use to me. And it would be better if both you and I just pretended you were dead and stepped into this practice of the handing of the inheritance. And so if you can already feel the offense behind that, immediately then you also start to recognize the foolishness in that question. Because not only is he being offensive, but now he's needing the father to in fact go and act this out. Right? He's saying, hey, Dad, it would be better for me if you were dead. So can you do me a favor and sell your stuff and give it to me? Right? It's not a good posture to begin. If you're going to go offend somebody, you better make sure that you don't depend on them to go and act out what your idea is. But in this case, he's gone in, he's offended the dad drastically, and he's still in a dependent position for the father to go and do something, so that the son can actually live this idea out. But you see the way that text plays out. So he divided his property between them. the Father goes and grants the Son's requests. And hereby giving us the first glimpse into just how generous, how deep is the grace of God. And that first glimpse is this, that regardless of whatever bad, foolish, offensive decisions may happen, the Father always has the last word. Specifically here, like the Father literally needs to have a word. He literally needs to step forward and act so the Son can have his way. But in addition, as you'll see the rest of the story play out, it will in fact be the Father's word that echoes longer throughout the realms of time than whatever this bad, foolish decision was. There were consequences. This was not wise on behalf of the Son. And yet the echoes of that decision and those consequences would not outlast the word that the Father would ultimately give in light of this. But let me keep moving on. You see the rest of the story play out. Starting in verse 13, it says this. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill the stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, the younger son said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.'" So this younger son gets his foolish request granted. He gets the money and he sets off to a distant land. And essentially, whatever pleasure he can think of, he pays for. He doesn't exercise the word no at any point after this, until there are three components that Jesus reveals to us. Number one, he runs out of money. Number two, there's a severe famine in the land. And number three, it seems like the result of these two components, running out of money and things being terribly just in his culture when it came to economics, the only job he could land was one where he would feed pigs. And it's really interesting that Jesus chooses to specifically highlight feeding of pigs as the only job this guy could get while telling this story. What's so fascinating about this is that Jesus is actually telling this story to an original audience that would have a Jewish background. And so when he gets to this point in the story to highlight being a feeder of pigs would have like a dog whistle effect to the ears of Jewish listeners, to the point where Jewish listeners would not just say, "Hey, ooh, tough luck." Like Jewish listeners would listen to the idea of being someone whose profession is to feed pigs, and they would be repulsed, offended, like at a very deep and core level, because it infringes and offends their religious sensibilities. And so Jesus here really is trying to paint a very specific picture of a guy who has hit rock bottom in his life. He's out of money, things in his society are going really terribly, and he literally has the worst job that a listener could imagine. Speaking about rock bottoms, I was really disappointed earlier when The Rock was like a picture that I didn't get right. Because actually, like, The Rock's one of my favorite people in the world to like follow on Instagram and keep up with. And it really kind of started back in the day as a wrestling fan, adult leaders, sponsors, wrestling people, maybe, yes, one of us. Right? In the years since, man, he's just done all kinds of amazing things. Been in all kinds of TV shows and movies. You probably know him from Jumanji. He's going to be in Black Adam coming up here at the end of the year. I will be there at 3 p.m. on Thursday of release. Got that already squared away. But what's so cool about The Rock these days is that any movie that he's into or TV show that he's a part of, he like won't do it unless it's produced by his own production company, $7 Productions. And $7 Productions actually has a pretty cool origin story behind the name that The Rock tells. And the way The Rock will tell it is, growing up as a high schooler, your age, he really had his sights set on being a pro football player. Like playing pro football was going to be the thing that gets him out of whatever it is he's trying to get out of. Playing pro football is going to be the thing that helps take his family to the next level. And sure enough, he pursues it, gets after it, gets a scholarship to the University of Miami, playing right next to future NFL Hall of Famers. But then things don't really work out in college, to the point that when he graduates, the only professional opportunity he can get is playing Canadian football. And then even that doesn't work out. At some point, the Canadian football team he's a part of cuts him. And so it's at this point, when he's staring literally at the end of a dream, the thing that he had placed all of his hopes in, that he thought was going to help take him and his family to the next level, this thing has come to an end. He's been cut, and he digs into his pocket, and he has $7 in change. And it's in this origin story that, of course, The Rock decided to name his production company, but additionally, something really fascinating happens to him at this point in life. Realizing he has only $7 in his pocket and trying to figure out, how am I going to get home? I just got cut. I'm not where I belong. He remembers, I can always call my dad. Like, no matter how bad it is, regardless of how much money I have in my pocket, I can pick up the phone and I can ask my dad to come get me. And sure enough, dad gets in the van, picks him up, gets him home, and then they figure out what to do next with life. But that rock bottom experience is so fascinating to me that even in that terrible space, he would remember, I can always call my dad. And here in this parable that Jesus is telling, the younger son has a similar moment. Everything's going terrible. He's literally having a rock bottom experience of his own. And in that space, as you read the story, the Bible tells us he came to his senses and he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving. I'm going to set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer to be worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And what's happening here is the son is remembering another glimpse into the generous grace of his father. And that next glimpse, that next flavor of the Father's grace is the idea of common grace. See, here the son is in such a terrible place that all he can think about is everyone within the dominion of his father's home, regardless of their status, regardless of what authority that they had, no matter where they were on the totem pole, like just being associated within the dominion of his father afforded them a common grace of having more than they needed. And here he was in this spot remembering, longing, hoping for, I just want some common grace. I don't even want to be seen as a son anymore. To have common grace, for my father to be so gracious, so generous, that everyone in his dominion has more than they need. Like just that. Can I have that? And this idea of common grace that's highlighted here, it's an idea that Jesus himself refers to in the Sermon on the Mount. The best way I can explain common grace, like for us, the way you and I experience it, is that you and I did not need to meet a certain level of holiness for the sun to rise this morning. Right? Like it didn't matter where you stood with the God of the universe. It didn't matter if you even believed in him. You got to experience the joy of the warmth that comes with the sun rising. There's not a minimum level of holiness, a minimum level of right standing necessary for you to experience the satisfaction that comes with laughter. Just the joy that comes with laughing at a good joke, at a good movie, laughing with your friends. Right, like there's not somebody coming around saying, "Oh, where are you in a standing with the eternal God of the universe to really experience the benefits?" No, like you just get to enjoy it and taste it and benefit from it, right? This is the concept of common grace that's being referred to here. And so the son finds himself in a spot where he just wants common grace, right? If I could just get that, it's way better than what I'm seeing. It's way better than what I'm experiencing. But then check out what happens next. Verse 20 says this. And so the younger son got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, put sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. And some really beautiful things are happening here. You've got this younger son who's really dead set on, I don't need to be a son again. If all I get is just the common grace that comes from being within the dominion of my father's household, that is more than enough. And he had this speech ready to go too. And sure enough, the Bible tells us that he goes home, but then the father saw him while he was still a long way off. That's really interesting that Jesus highlights that, while he was still a long way off. Because what Jesus is doing here in the story is he's trying to highlight, hey, the father was hoping for the return. The father was anticipating for the return. The father was expecting for the son to return. The father was regularly putting himself in a position in his home where he could see the farthest out to see, is today the day? Not only that, they eventually meet up and he starts working through his speech. He can just barely get half of it out before the father responds with, hey, go get the fattened calf. Hey, let's put a robe on him, put a ring on his finger. Let's get sandals on his feet. And what's so beautiful about the father's grace in this moment is that even though the son was just hoping for and begging for common grace, the father exceeds that with a celebration, not a pouring down and heaping of shame. He's expecting him to return, greets him with a celebration, and also hands over to him a declaration of his purpose and his calling. Because each one of those things, the robe, the ring, the sandals, they all represented a certain type of status within the father's home. They all represented a certain responsibility that the son would now have, not because he had to earn the father's grace, but because the grace had already been given to him. He's now free to contribute to the community that he's a part of, to the dominion of where his father oversees. And then it closes out this story with one final texture of God's grace. Verse 25 says this, meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. And so the older son called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has laid him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And the last glimpse into the generous grace of the Father is this, that even when things seem confusing, that even when the literal will of the Father is taking place, the celebration that's happening, the declaration of purpose and calling that the young son is experiencing is literally the will of the Father. That while that is happening, even if that makes you confused or angry, that the Father in his generous grace commits to be there. I'll sit with you. I'll help you navigate through this. It doesn't make sense. Yes, it makes you angry. Yes, my literal will is confusing you right now, but I'm right here with you. And what's so beautiful about the parable of the lost son is that at this point, Jesus was using it to describe the motive behind why he does ministry the way that he does, right? Like, can you see it? The way Jesus sees the grace of his Father, how it would spur him on and inspire him to meet and eat with anyone and everyone that would spend time with him, right? Like, that was the purpose then. But living on this side of the cross, we now can see the parable of the lost son as a spotlight into like the greater culmination of the story of redemption that is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? Because when Jesus Christ died on the cross, he declared once and for all that bad, foolish, and offensive decisions can never have the last word. It's the cross that has the final word, right? That because of who Jesus is and what he accomplished in his life, death, and resurrection, that salvation would be made commonly available to anyone who would step up and claim it, anyone who would step up and trust Jesus, right? That in everything that Jesus accomplished on the cross, that now our repentance can be met with celebration, right? There's not a heaping of shame waiting for us. It's a celebration that awaits you, and not just a celebration, but a declaration of purpose and calling in each one of our lives. Because at the end of the day, each one of us, we were made with a purpose. Before salvation took place, before that ever stepped into the picture, at your conception, you were designed with a specific contribution to make. And when you trust in Jesus, there's an echoing of a redeclaration of, hey, we're going to step into that contribution, into that unique design that I created you with for you to contribute to this world. And if that's not enough, because of who Jesus is and what he accomplished on the cross, you and I get the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is the God of the universe saying, hey, I'm literally with you to declare who Jesus is and what he's accomplished, no matter what happens. When it gets crazy, when it gets confusing, when my will is happening and you don't know how to make sense of it, I am with you. I am right there. And so as we wrap up, I want to lay 3 invitations at your feet today. Right? In light of this parable, in light of the unbelievably generous, gracious nature of the Father and how it's displayed in the gospel, I want to lay 3 invitations in front of you. For some of us, all 3 invitations will make sense for us. For others of us, maybe just one invitation makes sense. I'm not sure where you're at. I'm really trusting the Holy Spirit to illuminate that, to clarify what that means for you. But the 3 invitations that I want to lay in front of your feet, the first one is this. I want to invite you, in light of the generous grace of the Father, to trust in God's grace. Because I know there's people in here, we come to this week of camp, we come to this event from our home lives, but man, there's a terrible decision that looms over us. Something either that we did or something that was done to us. There's real consequences to it, and it just hangs over our head and it defines us. We can't escape this shadow of what this bad, foolish, offensive decision says about us. And again, I just want to invite you to trust God, trust Jesus, because on the cross it was forever declared that bad, offensive, foolish decisions and their consequences do not have the last word. You won't be met with a heaping of shame, but rather a celebration. The Father is looking for you to return. He's expecting you to come home. He's ready to meet you with a celebration and a declaration of purpose and calling. The next invitation that I'd lay in front of you is the invitation to remember and rehearse God's grace in your life. Remember and rehearse God's grace in your life. See, the thing about God being so generously gracious to us is that God has been gracious in our lives in ways that we may not even realize. Like God has been kinder to you and I, not only more than we deserve, but more than we even know. And so the invitation I'm trying to lay in front of you here is, what does it look like in your own life to take an inventory of God's grace? Well, what's it look like at some point this week, at some point while you're here, to intentionally create a space where you can evaluate your life and literally just look for the evidences of God's grace in your life? Is that you sitting off somewhere on your own with a journal? Is that you sitting around 2 or 3 of your trusted, closest friends that are here with you this week? Maybe it's you meeting with one of your adult leaders or coaches. I'm not sure what it looks like, but what would it look like for you to create some very intentional space to take an inventory of your life to try and recognize, where has God been gracious to me in ways that I've not even acknowledged, in ways that I've not even seen? And then what's it look like to preserve that, so that you might remember and rehearse God's grace in your life? Last invitation I'll leave for you is this, that with generous grace comes generous worship. A response to generous grace is generous worship. And this includes in song. Right, like we're going to have an opportunity here in just a few minutes to engage again in worship to the God of the universe in song. But literally, what does it look like in your life so that it might be a response to the gracious God of the universe? He's been so generously gracious to you. What does it look like that your life might reflect a response to that generosity? That's what worship is. Taking your life and making it be a response to the generous nature of who God is. And so with generous grace, a great response is generous worship. And so again, I'm not sure where we all kind of land on this today in regards to trusting Jesus finally for the first time, or maybe again, for some of us to remember and rehearse God's grace in our lives, or to respond with generous worship. And so here's what I want to do. I want to just ask everybody in the room to close your eyes and bow your heads. And I want to just create this simple space. It's just you and the Lord. It's just you and the Lord. And I want to just lay the simple question out to you. With everything that's been said tonight in regards to the generous nature of God's grace, what has been most memorable?